Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and this is a lecture on writing argumentative essays. All right. Okay, so for the purposes of this class, we're going to be writing a 4 to 6 page argumentative essay. All right, and there will be a number of paper topics that you can choose from, and those will be given up front. So you're welcome to pick any of those topics, and you're just going to pick one of the topics, right? I think I have listed as many as 10, so you can just choose one from the 10. And the way the structure of the paper works is it's a 3-part essay, and the whole essay will be 4 to 6 pages. So each part will be roughly a third of that, so maybe a page and a half each. The first section of the paper is that you're going to consider an issue, and you're going to take one stance on the issue and defend it. So maybe it's the pro side, right? And you defend the pro side. And then the second step of the paper is to take the other side, right? And what you're doing in the second part of the paper is you're trying to reply, to make counter arguments to the arguments that were given in step 1, right? So you're just taking the other side of the issue and defending it. And then lastly, the last part of the paper is to kind of go back to the first part, the first section of the paper that you wrote, and defend it in virtue of the counter arguments that were made in the second section. So it's kind of like a defense of section 1 in virtue of section 2. So you're kind of trying to rewrite section 1, if you will, and be mindful of the counter arguments that were made to it in section 2 of the paper. Okay. So, for example, say that you were writing a paper on whether marijuana should be legalized, right? Okay. So then the 3 parts of this paper: one, say you defended in section 1 that it should be. Okay, so here you're trying to give reasons in favor of the legalization of marijuana, right? And then you're going to again give maybe a page and a half to 2 pages of defense of the affirmative side here that marijuana should be legalized, right? Then step 2 of this paper would be to respond to step 1, really, right? So what you want to do here is try to make replies and counter arguments to the arguments that were given in step 1, you know. So for example, say you said that for example that in step 1 that the legalization of marijuana would create a lot of jobs, right? So in step 2, what you want to do is you want to try to respond to that kind of point. So for example, you might say something like, yeah, even though it's creating lots of jobs, those jobs most of them would likely be sort of minimum wage jobs, you know? So you're sort of trying to cast doubt on the argument in favor of the legalization of marijuana that you gave in section 1, right? Okay. And so then that's the point of section 2, is to just sort of respond to section 1, if you will. Okay, so then in the last section of the paper, the third section, what you simply want to do is you want to rewrite section 1, and you want to try to respond to all the counter arguments that were made in section 2 against it, right? You want to defend section 1 in virtue of section 2. So you might give responses on behalf of the argument you gave in section 1 to whatever counters were made in section 2. That's kind of the point, right? So you're trying to again reaffirm that marijuana should be legalized, for example, like you made the point you made in section 1. Okay. So now, given the understanding now of how the paper should be written, the formatting, right? This 3-part format. Let's just talk for a minute about just writing papers more generally. So the first thing I want to say is that the whole purpose of this paper, this is an argumentative essay. And so what you're trying to do is take a position and defend it with reasons, right? So again, if our, like we discussed in our example there, if we're trying to defend the position that marijuana should be legalized, we're giving reasons to support that, you know? We're talking about the taxes it generates and the revenues and the jobs it creates and so on, right? We want to support that claim with reasons, right? Okay. The next point I want to make about paper writing in general is that you want to make sure to keep the scope of your paper narrow, right? Now here's kind of what I mean. Some of my students make this kind of mistake of trying to do way too much in a paper, right? So there's way too many reasons given, way too much argument, and they just try to cover too much ground, you know? So I always tell my students, look, just try to make a few really good points. You know, can you make one or two really good arguments in a paper? And you know, that really should be the goal, right? Can we make one or two really good points and present them well? And if so, that's a good paper, right? We don't need to make 50 good points, you know, or even 20 or 10, right? It's just one or two really good points written well and made persuasively, and that's an A paper, okay? The next thing I'll say is that a lot of students will make this kind of mistake of trying to just sit down and write a paper, you know? A couple of nights before it's due, I'm just gonna get at it. I'm gonna sit down literally without having thought about it at all and try to just, sort of write out this 6-page paper. You really can't do that, right? So one of the things that's just so easy as a kind of helpful hint is just to simply think about the paper before you begin writing it. Personally, I always kind of do that. When I'm about to write a paper, I just put a lot of thought into how it might go. And it's almost like in my mind, what I'm doing is trying to generate the paper before I actually sit down and write it. So you think for yourself, well, what am I going to argue? What's my conclusion going to be? What are my reasons going to be? Like a couple, And you just get kind of this basic outline in your mind, and that kind of gives you a head start to writing the paper, right? It sets you off, and so that when you sit down to actually write it or type it, you have a plan already, right? So that would be my next sort of hint. The next one would be the fourth kind of hint would be to signpost, right? Which is to use words like thus and therefore and hence, and what that does is when you start using words like that, it really helps me as the reader, the person grading your paper, to see where you're going, So if at the end of the paper you write in conclusion, da 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 da, and you state your conclusion, it's really easy for me to spot that and to pick it out and to follow exactly what you're doing, right? If you lose me, right, and I'm not sure where you're going, and you're just kind of walking around aimlessly in this paper, not really guiding me with these signposts, sometimes I get confused about what I'm reading and it's not really clear, and so this is just a way to be clear in your writing, is to use these kind of signposts in your writing. So the next 2 points, one is that you want to make sure that really every bit of your paper should help to make its argument, right? So if you've got a sentence or a paragraph that really doesn't do any work, that's just like a side point, then you should just sort of get rid of it. The next point is that we want to try to anticipate objections, right? So when you make an argument in a paper, you want to always try to think about how someone might respond to your argument, right? And so then you can mention, an objector might say this, and then you can try to, respond to that objection before it's even made, And what that essentially does is it makes your argument seem more defensible, right? So the last 2 points I want to make, one is just to be careful about clarity in your writing, right? And with regard to clarity, there's kind of 2 things that can go wrong, right? The first is that we can write in a vague way, okay? So a claim is vague when it's unclear, when it lacks detail, right? Essentially when it's not clear what exactly you mean by it, And so an example I have here is if I said something like, last year I made tons of money, right? That's a vague claim. It's not clear at all what tons of money is, maybe it's $100. Maybe it's 1,000. Maybe it's 100,000. You don't really know. So if we have vague claims like that, all we have to do is just add a little detail to clarify. So for example, maybe it's I made $3,000 a month last year, $3,500 a month last year. But if you specify quite clearly what you mean by tons of money, then the vagueness goes away, right? So be careful when you write about the claims you make being vague, and you just want to make sure to add enough detail to clarify that vagueness. So, the last point is about ambiguities, which is also a way that writing can be unclear. So an ambiguity is a claim that's ambiguous is a claim that is subject to more than one interpretation. So we can take it to mean two different things. So for example, if I said Jessica is cold, I can mean Jessica is cold-hearted, has a cold personality, right? Or I can mean she's physically freezing cold, right? So Jessica is cold is an ambiguous claim, right? Now, obviously, if we have ambiguities running in our paper, what we want to do is just clarify the ambiguity. So for example, I could say Jessica is freezing cold to clarify that one, right? Now, the last point I'll make is about the difference between what's called a semantic and a syntactic ambiguity. So semantic ambiguity is an ambiguity that results from the meanings of or the meaning of a word in a sentence, right? So if, for example, a word or phrase is ambiguous, the meaning of it's ambiguous, then the whole sentence becomes ambiguous, right? So for example, if I said, I know a little Italian, right? I know a little Italian. I could mean one of two things. I could mean that I know a little Italian person or a little bit of the Italian language, right? And then when I say I know a little Italian, it's just really not clear what I mean by that, okay? So again, when you have an ambiguity like that, all you have to do is just clarify the meaning by adding the necessary detail. So I know a little bit of the Italian language would clarify there. The last type of ambiguity is a syntactic one. And syntactic ambiguities are a result of the structure of our language, right? That's called syntax. So, so we have, for example, an example here is imagine that you're, like at the DMV or something like that, where they're asking for identification, or the Social Security office or something, and you see the sign that says you will need your birth certificate or your driver's license and some other photo ID, right? Now, here the claim could mean one of two things. Either you'll need a birth certificate on the one hand, or a driver's license and some other photo ID on the other, or you'll need either a birth certificate or a driver's license, plus either way some other photo ID, right? Now here, this ambiguity is simply a result of a lack of grammar, right? This could be clarified with just simply adding a comma. So for example, if I put a comma after driver's license, right? So you will need your birth certificate or your driver's license, comma, and some other photo ID, then that means essentially what that claim means is that you're going to need either the birth certificate or the driver's license plus either way some other photo ID. So a comma there does the trick and it clarifies that ambiguity, right? So I think the point here in the end is that we just want to be careful with how we write. We want to be writing clearly, and if we aren't writing clearly, then we just need to add the details or maybe the grammar or the comma to clarify. So that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed the lecture, and we'll see you next time.